everyone, and welcome to Next Generation's first parent panel. Today, for the next hour and a half, we're going to be speaking to parents from our community who are answering questions anonymously submitted by adoptees within the community as well. We're first going to do introductions, and then we'll move on to the questions. So I'll start. My name is Kat Erdahl. I am secretary in the board of directors for Next Generation Guatemala, and I am the host of this panel. And so we are going to jump over to Laura, who is going to introduce herself first.
Hi, I'm Laura Hernan. I live in Seattle. I'm a full-time mom to 4. My youngest is from Guatemala, and he's 13 years old. And my children range from 13 to 23.
Thank you so much. Then we're going to go over to Tom.
Okay, hi, my name's Tom Rawson. I live in Massachusetts, and I have 2 children from Guatemala. They're both young adults now. And one interesting fact about our family is my children were adopted older. Spanish is their first language, so our whole family is bilingual.
Thank you so much, Tom. And then we're going to go over to Becky.
I'm Becky. I'm in Minneapolis. I'm a single adoptive mom. I've got 2 daughters. My oldest was born in China, and Kat was born in Guatemala.
Thank you so much. And then we're going to go over to Paige.
Hi, my name is Paige Fleury. I live in Oakland. I started out as a single adoptive mom to my son, who is now 17. Met my husband. We got married and adopted another child from Guatemala, my daughter, who is 13. And I am a full-time mom and a full-time strategist, and I coach soccer with Soccer Without Borders, which is for immigrant and refugee youth. And coincidentally, right now, our team is primarily Guatemalan.
Well, thank you so much for those introductions. And again, these questions that are going to be asked today are anonymously submitted by adoptees within the community. But if you're watching this and throughout the video or the panel, you have a question that comes to your mind, the last 15 minutes of this panel is going to be open to questions from the live stream. So if you have a question, save it for the last 15 minutes, and there's a chance that we answer it live today. With that, going forward, we're going to ask the first question. So our first question for the panel is, why did you choose to adopt from Guatemala? Okay, we're going to start with Paige.
So when I was on my adoption journey, I looked at both domestic and international adoption, including Kazakhstan and Russia and China, etc. But I grew up in San Diego. And so I had a lot of friends that were Latinx, and here in my community, we have a lot of Latinx from many different countries. So when I opened the page for Guatemalan adoption, I also happened to have been studying Spanish for 2 years. And I burst into tears and I said, this is it. And I realized it was a culture that I was most comfortable with and knew I could support, both in terms of language and in all of the everyday parts of culture that I thought would be beneficial to my kids. And I didn't necessarily have that with other opportunities.
Thank you so much. We're going to pass the mic over to Laura.
So for us, it was really kind of demographics, if you will. We have 3 older children who are not adopted. We wanted a 4th, had always been really positive about adoption, but we didn't feel like we needed the pregnancy and newborn experience again, and decided to leave sort of the newborn experience for other parents who maybe would not have had the chance to experience it. But we wanted to keep the birth order. And Franklin's older sister is the next oldest is 20 months. So we wanted an infant or baby, but not necessarily a newborn. If we had our druthers, we wanted a boy to kind of even out the family numbers. And so I, sat with an adoption consultant and really just narrowed it down to Guatemala.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
So our reasons are very similar to what Paige described. A little bit of serendipity, chance, in there, we were working with an agency looking to adopt, and we had already decided that we wanted to adopt from Central America because of just the kind of reasons that Paige described, that we felt like it was really important to integrate the child's culture into our family. And that was when we felt we could do easily. And our agency identified a child who needed a family from Guatemala. And also my wife had spent time there earlier and knew the country. So it was that combination of factors.
Thank you so much. And then lastly, we're going to pass the mic over to Becky.
My experience is different than the others. I was in the process of adopting, or thought I was in the process of adopting, a second child from China when China closed, and my adoption agency said there are openings in Guatemala, and we made a quick shift and I got the referral for Kat. So it wasn't a deliberate choice on my part.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And then our next question kind of goes along with this theme of why did you choose to adopt from Guatemala? And the next question is, did you do any research regarding Guatemalan culture and or history prior to adopting from Guatemala? Okay, perfect. We're going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So prior to making the decision to adopt from Guatemala, I did not do research. But once I had made that decision, I'm a very linear thinker and I'm all about research. So then I did start doing a lot of research and learned a lot about what was happening in Guatemala at that time, 2003, and what had been happening historically, which for me confirmed my choice to adopt from Guatemala, because I felt like there were kids who needed families as much as I wanted to become a parent, and biology didn't matter to me. But I was also glad that I was later in the process, because there were a lot of things that came up that concerned me about past adoption because of basically the genocide and guerrilla warfare and all of that. So that was really eye-opening for me.
Thank you so much. And then it's Tom who is next.
So we did some research and learning, but my wife had already spent several months in Guatemala and knew the country pretty well, certainly compared to me. We spent a lot of time, me learning Spanish and her refreshing her Spanish. And I did some reading about the country and the culture because I didn't know much about it beforehand. And also a lot of talking with her because she did know quite a bit.
Thank you so much. And then this is kind of a question jumping off of what both of you just said. And maybe all of you would be able to answer from your own different perspectives. But like you're saying, Tom, you kind of started learning more Spanish. Did you feel that that was necessary in the adoption process, or was the adoption set up more so that English was like, it wasn't a huge, the language barrier wasn't as big through the actual adoption process? And then Tom, you are all good to go.
Well, for us, we were adopting an older child. So it was, Spanish was their first language, and it was, from our point of view, essential to know Spanish. And my wife already did, but I have sort of an aptitude for languages, so I really enjoyed learning it. And then I learned a lot from them when they arrived. But it was really important because this was a child who was already well old enough to be speaking, and we need to be able to communicate with them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And then I believe, Paige, you're next.
Yes, and clarifying this about language, not necessarily adoption process.
Just kind of how language was involved in the adoption process. Like, was it a huge hurdle to get over through the adoption process, or was the adoption process kind of catered to the English language at all?
I did feel like it was catered to the English language because I was, dealing with, a Jewish adoption center, and everything was translated for me. But I also knew that language was going to be essential for my child. And part of that was my adoption agency did a lot of workshops for transnational, transcultural adoption. And I heard from adoptees how important it was for them. If I look a certain way, I'm associated with the language, I want to know that language. So for me, that regardless of how the process was set up, I knew that was going to be important.
Well, thank you so much. And then Becky, you had your hand up.
Oh, I was just going to answer your original question. The language was not particularly necessary in the process. The orphanage where you were was run by a group from the United States. All of the process was handled in English. And so that went pretty smoothly, even though I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. And then I believe, Tom, you had your hand up as next.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one little thing, which is it also, I learned the language and my wife refreshed it to be able to speak with our child, but it also proved to be very useful while we were in Guatemala, reading documents, understanding what was going on. And we got translations like everybody did, but we also were able to figure things out for ourselves, and that was really helpful.
Thank you so much. And then Paige, did you have your hand up or did I forget to lower?
You just forgot to lower.
So sorry about that. So the next question, going along, kind of talking about the adoption process itself. Do you guys understand the adoption process prior to adopting, or was it all very new to you? I'm going to pass the mic back to Paige.
So I was fairly aware of it, both through my own research, but also in my family. My sister's adopted, my niece is adopted, my mom's adopted, my cousins are. So for me, adoption was always what I was going to do. So the process itself, I didn't find any big surprises in, other than it did make me feel like every parent should go through some of this vetting, regardless of how you become a parent, because there were a lot of things that you had to think about. And I loved that they asked questions about how will you support your child's culture, which that was a surprise to me, that aspect of it. And because all of my other adoption experiences were about domestic adoption. So that for me was a surprise, but the rest was fairly familiar with.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Yeah, so even though we had known that adoption was a possibility and always felt really positive about it, we did not know anything about the adoption process going in. And for sort of a type A parent, if you will, it was really difficult for me to sort of rely on the agency for something so incredibly important. And that was, it was kind of a leap of faith that I had to take. That was quite difficult to say, okay, you're the experts and we have to rely on you. And that wasn't always entirely a smooth transition for us.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Becky.
I had been through the adoption process first with my daughter in China. And the only surprise for me in Guatemala was that in China, I got the referral at basically the end of the process. And here's your referral and now be there in 2 weeks. Where as in Guatemala, I got the referral. Here's your picture of your daughter who's 4 weeks old. And I wasn't able to bring her home for another 9 months. So that was a hard, long wait.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So just building on what Becky said, that was something that was completely different. My son was referred at 2 weeks old and was home at 5 months. And I didn't know how that was going to work. And we kind of lucked out. And then my daughter referred at about the same age and didn't come home until 14 months. So there were a lot of things going on in Guatemala at that time around adoption and the PGN. And that whole part was new to me and really a challenge. I think it's hard, particularly because I got to meet my daughter and then had to leave her and come back. And that was heartbreaking, because I think at least for me, and I don't know, I see, Becky, you're nodding, like you see this picture of your child and that is your child and you feel that immediately. And so that waiting process and knowing that it could fall through for any number of reasons was really challenging. If it had fallen through because her birth mother had changed her mind or my sons had changed her mind, that would be heartbreaking but understandable. And I would always defer to the birth mother. But knowing that there were political things and other things that were holding it up made it incredibly difficult. I actually cried with my daughter when we came through immigration, and I knew that nothing could happen to separate us. Sorry, that part I think I just blocked out.
Well, no worries. That is, I actually remember growing up and my mom telling me, and this is when people could meet you at the gate at airports, telling me that they were the joy of bringing me off the plane and the family being there. And it's just such a momentous moment when you kind of step off that first couple of steps when you get off the plane. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
So for us, learning the process was kind of this weird mix, because on the one hand, we didn't know the process ahead of time and we had to kind of learn everything about it. We always knew we were going to adopt, but we just learned about the process as we did it. And I thought it was very weird because on the one hand, they're asking you these questions that are really important. And as I think Paige said, like every parent should be asked these questions. On the other hand, you have to do all this bureaucratic stuff, some of which is just somebody somewhere decided you have to jump through this hoop, and it doesn't actually mean anything about making the adoption work well or be safe or whatever. So it was both exhilarating and frustrating at the same time, and challenging, which it should, and challenging in a good way, that it should have been, because they were asking good questions.
Thank you so much. So we're kind of going to move the questions forward a little bit. The majority of questions submitted by the adoptees within the community have been centered around race, culture, and family dynamics, with the biggest topic being race. And so we're going to, race and culture more specifically. So I'm going to go to the question of, so did you incorporate any Guatemalan culture into your child's upbringing? And if so, how and what? And what was your take on that? Through your parenting. Perfect. I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Well, we were really fortunate actually that the children and I and my husband to a lesser degree spent about 2.5 months in Guatemala right at the end of the process. And we're able to sort of bond as a family, you know, in the culture, as far as Antigua is the culture. And then, you know, we all sort of fell in love with Guatemala and kind of decided that was going to be the family vacation spot, you know, down the road. And so I think, you know, we try to, you know, have Guatemalan art and Guatemalan textiles and things like that around the house. But I think for us, I would say the cultural education came through traveling back kind of again and again and exploring different parts of Guatemala with the emphasis on the beauty and the fun and the warmth of the people. And I've found that to be a really successful way to, you know, make it sort of a whole family thing, as opposed to, you know, Franklin, you now need to learn about this. You know, the whole family kind of went through the journey together.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So definitely tried to incorporate it from day one. I think I did a better job with my daughter than my son. With my son, it was about textiles and books and things that I purchased when I was in Guatemala, but with him, I was only there for a few days. And, you know, I had language, but with my daughter, we also had the opportunity to live in Antigua. So it wasn't long, you know, it was 4 or 5 weeks, but it was just the two of us. And again, taking things from there, including a huipil from her area that is upstairs on our wall, and making sure when we were home, I spoke only Spanish with her until she was 10. And then my language couldn't keep up with some of the subtleties, incorporating food. But one of my biggest regrets is not traveling back to Guatemala with the kids because of some resistance on their side, which we can get into later. But I wish that we had done that, Laura, and done more of that with our kids. But I wanted to make sure they were always represented in our daily life. They're both Indigenous, and making sure we represented that. And even when we travel to Mexico, we always go to Mayan areas where they're in the majority and I'm in the minority.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
So the answer to the original question is absolutely yes. We did that, and it was kind of like, it was both something we wanted to do, and it was just natural because, as I said, our children were adopted a little older, sort of school or preschool age. And so they came with language and culture, that was theirs. And it was kind of our job to learn it in some ways from them and in some ways on our own. And so it's always been part of our family since our older one came into our family. And we've done there's lots of things. We've been back many, many times. That's been really the only, with one exception, the only significant travel that we've done as a family has all been going back to Guatemala. We've been, I don't know, it's 14 or 15 times. And we have friends there, they have friends there, we have family connections there. So it's very much a piece of advice that we got early on that was really good advice was normalize it. Make that just a normal part of life that you travel to Guatemala. It's not something special and unusual. And that really, I think, played a big role in making things work well. And also the fact that we spoke the language. Our older one, nobody in the house spoke anything but Spanish for a year after they were here. I still speak almost all Spanish, even though they're young adults. They answer me in English, and that's fine. But I still continue with the Spanish, and they have it and can use it and do use it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Becky.
There you go. I would say we've done some of the same things, perhaps to a lesser extent. As I mentioned, we're dealing with a couple different cultures in our family. So we've been back a couple times to Guatemala. We've been to China. We participated in both an organization called Families with Children from China and La Semana, which was it's a large adoptive community in the Twin Cities for families with children from Latin America. And I really tried to follow the lead. My kids have really different reactions, feelings, curiosity, openness to their cultures and stories, and I try to follow what seems most appropriate for each of them.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to pass the mic back over to Paige.
So I hear what you're saying about kids having different reactions. My son being very much into learning about his culture, my daughter being very resistant. But I wanted to note something that I did that might have been a mistake. I raised my kids with lots of awareness about what it meant to be Latinx, not Guatemalan. And I kind of had this broader approach. And both of my kids went to Escuela Bilingüe, so it was Spanish immersion, and they're with people from lots of different countries, all native speakers. But it wasn't until my son was a teenager that he expressed the fact that a lot of people think he's Mexican. And he wants to correct them and say I'm Guatemalan, but he didn't know what it meant to be Guatemalan. Despite my efforts to just talk about the beauty of the country and the warmth of the people and all the books and movies, so many things focus on genocide and the negativity of it. And I wish I had done a better job of building up what it meant to be Guatemalan, but that's been a little bit of a struggle. I have talked to Guatemalan friends and I try to bring it in, and we're doing lots of cooking now, and we were going to Guatemala and then a pandemic hit. But I just want to own that mistake, which I didn't realize was a mistake till my son was a teen.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And one of the reasons I asked this question is because it comes up a lot within the Guatemalan community or adoptee community. One of the fun things to do is kind of compare our upbringings and what it was like. Did we have a lot of exposure to Guatemalan culture? And some of us didn't have a lot of exposure, and some of us didn't really want a lot of exposure to it. And some of us really, really want a lot of exposure to the culture. And it is so different across the board. So I wanted to include this question. Another thing that's talked about a lot within the adoptee community is kind of the funny things that comments or interactions we have with others who have been adopted that we kind of come into. For example, one of these comments that I've gotten is, "Oh, you look so much like your mother," before they know I'm adopted, or something like that. Where matter of fact is, I don't look like my mother. And so kind of trying to say something nice, and in their head it's very nice, but matter of fact is it's not necessarily true. So my next question is, many adoptees face awkward questions such as, "Where are your real parents?" or comments such as, "You look so much like your mother," regularly growing up. Were there any awkward questions or comments that any of you guys came into relating to adoption or race culture when it comes to your children or families? Paige has her hand up, so I'm going to pass the mic back over to you.
My husband and I were just talking about that this morning. We were pretty lucky because of where we live, being really diverse, but we would still get things like the mailbox store down the street where the woman would say, "Oh, it's so great you can love a child that's not yours." And I would have to say, "No, he is mine." Or I would get, "What is he? Where'd you get him?" We would travel outside of this area, and I had a woman who I knew was well-meaning. She was like, "Oh, your son's beautiful. We have another one of those down in Sierra City." So lots of comments, less so as he got older, but I always had to look at the person's intention and realize this was ignorance. So here was an opportunity to correct them kindly and keep referring to my son or my daughter as, we're one, because I didn't want there to ever be like they're not less than or different. This is my child. So all the time when he was a baby, and most people thought he was Thai. So.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Yeah, I think the comment that we get regularly that makes me kind of the most squeamish is the, and it's well-meaning, but, "Oh, he's so lucky that you adopted him," or "He won the lottery when you adopted him," or "What would his life have been if you hadn't adopted him?" And it just, it's one of those things, like, I cannot articulate how I feel about my child, any of my children. And I want to just, I want them just to look in my heart and see that this is not, he lost a lot when we adopted him. They've never seen the beauty of the country. They've never met his birth mother and watched their interactions together. And, they don't know what he gave up to join our family. And then if they could just look in my heart, and the same with his father and his older siblings, we would not be the family we are without him. And that is the comment that always just gets every sort of nerve of mine on edge. And that I find really difficult to respond to, because when I try to respond to it, they are a lot of times patronizing and saying, "Oh, yeah, of course you're the lucky ones," and it's just something that I find really, really frustrating and difficult to respond to.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's an interesting one, because it's something that both the adoptees and parents face in different contexts of like kind of the savior, or you save them versus, or you should be thankful to the adoptees. So are you thankful that you got saved, basically? And I think that's another hot topic in the adoptee community is this, how do you respond to that when people tell you as an adoptee that you should be thankful or happy? I'm gonna pass the mic over to Tom next.
So we totally got all of these things happening, and we live in an area where it's not unusual to see people of different races and backgrounds, and we still got them all because people see the contrast between, particularly when they were younger, between us and our kids. And I feel like the thing that stands out to me is, yeah, they would say we were lucky, they would say they were lucky. It's like, and our reaction, and our reaction was to try to keep that from happening because we thought it was unfair to our kids to have to experience that any way we could, whether we had to respond to people or not, because I feel like it's racism. It's not racism in the sort of, overt, harsh sense of it, but the fact that people feel free to comment on your family when you don't look like the norm that they're used to. And no matter which way they're commenting, they don't feel free. They don't comment like that on families where everybody looks the same. And so we just felt like, how do we try to keep this from happening? And then when it did happen, the response depends on the situation and who it is. But the thing that really stood out to me was the degree to which people felt like they had the right to comment on our family in whatever the comment was. So that was the thing that concerned us the most. And it definitely happened a lot. And some of that, we eventually moved from one community to another for a lot of reasons related to adoption, but the degree of comfort that our kids felt in the more diverse community was one of those reasons.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Before we move on to the next answer, we have Jessica here who's joining us. And just quickly, maybe under a minute, introduce who you are, your connection to Guatemalan adoption, and then we can move on to Paige next, I believe.
Okay, hi. First of all, I'm so sorry I'm late. If anyone knows me, they know I'm time and technologically challenged, time zone challenged. Anyway, I totally apologize. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
so I'm the adoptive mother of 2 children from Guatemala. My daughter, Olivia, is 18. My son, Mateo, is 16. We visit Guatemala every summer. We rent a house with a group of other adoptive families and we travel around the country. We've been in reunion with my kids' birth mothers for some 10 years. And I'm also the author of 2 books about Guatemala. One is titled Mamalita, which was a memoir about adopting my daughter. And one is titled Mother, Mother, which is a novel set in California and Guatemala. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. And so the question that we're on right now is we're talking about kind of awkward or ignorant comments that we as adoptive families, and more specifically adoptive parents, you guys have received as adoptive parents. And I believe it was Paige who was next, unless I don't believe Hanson.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick thing to what Tom said. Somehow, I'm white. My husband is 6'4" Nordic white. And the way that opened up, for some reason, people feeling like they could ask questions about the origins of our family. And I talked about how I would try to look at their intention and it was ignorance. So how could I lovingly redirect? I will say there were times where I got really pissed off and I didn't like the tone or the way it was asked. And I would say, well, before I answer that, can you tell me, how did you conceive your child? Was it IUI, IVF? What position were you in when you conceived your child? So they could see just how invasive and ridiculous their question was. I'm getting all flushed because I remember using that several times when I was just done with trying to educate people. And it usually shut that conversation down pretty quickly, and they would be apologetic and shuffle away.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to pass the mic over to Becky.
Yeah, I would say I had all of those same questions, and, you know, people looking at me at the Target store with 2 kids, 1 Asian, 1 Latinx, and saying, are they both your kids? Like, and it just got to the point where it was like, I can't answer these. And just moving on and trying to think about what was the most important thing for my kids to hear me say about them that would be affirming.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
So a couple things just in response. I agree with what Becky said, that a lot of times the way we would respond to these things were about what we wanted our kids to know. And it really had nothing to do with what the other person needed to know. And, you know, if you can do both, fine. But the most important thing to us was that our kids understood who they, you know, what was important in that situation. And, you know, we would get, you know, are they really sisters? And, you know, a lot of times we would just say, of course, and walk away, because what we didn't want was another question and another question. The other thing I wanted to say is that some of these comments about people being lucky or having good fortune from adoption, we also get them from our friends in Guatemala when we're visiting with them. And that feels completely different. It's a whole different take on the situation. It's coming from an understanding from them of kind of what the benefits are to the kids. And yeah, there may be pieces they're missing, but it's totally different than strangers in the grocery store. So we've kind of had to think about that difference. And also we get that sometimes from friends from Central America who live here in the US. And it has a very different feel than when it's coming from random white strangers in the grocery store. So that's something we've had to navigate as well.
Thank you so much for all your answers. My next question is a question bouncing off of this. As an adoptee who's faced many of these questions, for instance, even going to early elementary school, people being like, is that your real mom? Where is your real mom? For adoptees going through this right now, whether they be younger or older, what would be your advice for adoptees facing this? I know that there have been times where people have told me to maybe be thankful that I did maybe feel like I should be thankful for being in the family that I'm in. There have been times where I felt almost guilty. So what would your advice be for maybe adoptees going through this, who want to go to their families and say, hey, someone said this to me today. This is how I'm feeling about it. Is it something that has ever happened to you maybe, or what would your advice overall be to the adoptee? And then it looks like I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I believe I've pointed out to my son, if not other people, is, you know, with this comment, like you just said, Kat, of, you know, you should be so grateful to your parents and stuff like that. And I've, you know, we have 3 children, older children, who literally would not exist on this planet if we had not we literally gave them life. And, you know, I've said before, you know, why on earth should Franklin be more grateful to us than the children who literally wouldn't exist without us? You know, it's just nobody's ever said to them, aren't you so grateful to your parents for making you, you know? And it's just such a ridiculous false equivalent, if you will, that for some reason he should be grateful to us, when in reality, if we hadn't adopted him, most likely he would have been adopted by another lovely family. You know, who he should be, you know, thinking about is the sacrifice, the most generous sacrifice that his mother made. You know, she's the one who made the sacrifice. And it's just always been this sort of illogical disconnect for me, that why should he be grateful to us? That I don't know if I'm making sense or answering the question, but
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica.
Thank you. Interestingly, as my kids, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Interestingly, especially my daughter, as she's gotten older, she's now 18, and she's able to have a lot more insight into her own story. And she has said to me, grateful what? I was, who is grateful for being taken from their birth family? Who? In any situation, no matter what the situation is, nobody wishes that on somebody. So I think that as my kids get older, as our kids get older, and as anyone who's watching this becomes more mature, they realize that yes, there's beauty in being with the family that they're in, but there's also incredible loss from the family that they're no longer in. So it's not one, it's not the other, it's both. So the gratitude story, as Laura just said, no child is grateful for being born to nobody expects that. So it's not really a question anyone should be asked. I mean, it's funny because I say all the time, like I go for a walk in my beautiful neighborhood. We live near a mountain, and I say, oh, I'm so grateful to live here. It's so beautiful. I'm so grateful to be here. But I would never say that to my children. It's really interesting. I'm hyper aware of that. And I think that's something as adoptive parents, we all are very aware of, that we're very careful with the kind of language we use around our kids, around adoption. And that's one word I'm very, very careful about is grateful.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Becky.
Your question about what to say to young people when they get asked hard questions about who's your real parent or are they your real parent. I'm not sure I necessarily have specific advice because I think how kids both understand and want to answer that will change with time. I think what's most important is that from an exceptionally early age, adoptive kids know they can ask anything, they can say anything, that it's safe to talk about and define those hard questions in ways that are helpful and meaningful for them, and that as adoptive parents, we need to be supportive and encouraging and good listeners.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
Okay, I like what everybody else is saying, and I also just want to say in terms of advice to adoptees who experience this, the kind of first thought that came to mind was you can answer that question however you want, including not at all. And that it's the adoption story is your story, and it's nobody else's business unless you feel like telling them. Because I think it's going to depend. Like, is that your best friend that you've known for 5 years and who loves you and is really curious about something in a genuine way? Or is that a random person who noticed that you don't look like your parents? Your answers are probably going to want to be different. But the main message I would have is, be true to yourself and answer it however seems right to you. And you don't have to tell people your story. And we've really emphasized that with our children, and they're very, I had a whole conversation with each of them about coming on this panel because I said, I'm talking about adoption. This is your story. Is it okay if I go and do this? And I'm not going to say your names, and I'm not going to talk about a lot of details about you, but I still wanted it to be okay. And I feel like that's something that's really important for adoptees to have a sense of, is this is my story and I can tell whatever parts of it I want to or don't want to.
Thank you so much for everyone who's answered. We're going to move on to the next question, which kind of goes along with this. How I mentioned earlier that another hot topic in the group has been race, and we are all part of, multi-race families. Were racial/ethnic differences a discussion in your household? Why I bring this up is this past year, there's been a lot of racialized events happening in our culture and in our right in front of our eyes. And that has sparked such a huge discussion within the adoptee community with our own experience of whether it be racism, racial differences, or even just for those of us who had different experience talking about race within the household. Was talking about race and or racial differences a common occurrence in your household? How was it handled? And yeah, so that's my question. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So I would say, partly because we live in the Bay Area, this is a discussion on a regular basis at our dinner table and has been forever. But when it really happened the first time was when my son was in preschool and he said, "Mama, people with skin like you killed Martin Luther King." And I thought, wow, he's 3.5, 4, and he's making this distinction between our skin tones and a value associated with that. We are very fortunate to live in an area where we index very high in Guatemalan adoption, and he was in a school with a lot of families that looked like ours, either through even biology, where we have a Latina mom and white dad. But we realized we just needed to talk about a lot of things that had to do with how people are perceived. And a lot of this started happening when my son was a teenager, and I had to make him more aware. I had to have the talk and letting him know that it's not right the way you may be perceived or judged, and the way that you have to hold yourself and dress yourself because of idiocy in the world. But it is, particularly with my son, a topic we have a lot. And again, we're fortunate to live in an area, and they've gone to schools where that is part of the discussion on an ongoing basis as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
Yeah, not too much to add, but it's very similar. We talk about this all the time. One of our children more than the other brings it up, and she will hold our feet to the fire, and she should, and that's good, and we learn from it. And I'll make some offhand comment about something, and she'll say, "Yeah, well, you can say that because you're white." And then I have to stop and think, okay, what's she talking about? And but it's really literally every day. One of my children has moved out of the house and is living independently, but one is, they're both young adults, as I said. One's in college and still lives here. So, but with both of them, we talk about this all the time. Very common topic of conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Becky.
I think we've talked about it more and more as my daughters have gotten older, and I realized that I couldn't pass along my white privilege to them as they went out into the world by themselves. And that, naively came as a bit of a shock, that I became more aware of racism and how the world sees my kids and kids that look like them. And there wasn't anything that I could do to intervene. I mean, we could have the talk, we could talk about trying to change systemic racism, but it's clear white supremacy is incredibly powerful in this culture, and we need to be working on that all the time. But the conversations increased as it became more relevant. And I don't know about the other parents, but I found at different points dealing with the educational system that teachers, schools would have lower expectations for my kids and would actually say things like, well, you just can't expect her to, perform as your child would. And it was completely bunk and crazy making.
I do remember some of that. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica.
Thank you. Wow, Becky, that's pretty amazing that you got that from your school system. I am sorry that happened. That's pretty incredible. It's horrible. It's so interesting because I just want to back up what everybody else said. But the interesting thing to me was, as a parent, my kids started talking about color similar to your children when they were like 3 years old. I think you said that, Paige. I think that was the first time I had a conversation with my daughter, Olivia, and she started talking about my skin tone was this, her skin tone was that, Mateo, her brother, skin tone was something else, and my husband was something else. And, you know, it was really interesting to me because the narrative that I always heard was kids don't see color, you know, people don't notice that, and they're taught. Well, that wasn't our experience at all. They started noticing it at a very early age. I will say it's a conversation we have frequently, daily, probably, especially now. My daughter is so interested in the subject. She's a senior in high school. Her favorite class is Students Organized Against Racism. It's an ethnic studies class in her high school. And I think one of the reasons why she's so interested in that subject is the way, obviously, she walks through the world, and also the way that we talk about it a lot. And so she knows that it matters to us, and it also matters to her. So good question. And yes, we talk about it very, very frequently.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
I just wanted to piggyback on something your mom said about the school environment. We were very lucky to be in a school that we helped start that was bilingual, and it was very progressive, and it's international baccalaureate. But my son has some pretty profound learning differences. And what we rapidly learned when we were looking at other options is there was a perception about boys of color in school. And the idea that they're just not paying attention, they're acting out. We looked at stats at different schools in terms of suspensions and disciplinary actions against kids of color. And I think that parents who say that this doesn't exist where they live, or that's not really something that happens, really need to dig deep and realize, here I am in one of the most progressive areas in the country, and we're still dealing with systemic racism, whether it's in the education system or outside of that. And it is disheartening sometimes when I'm on the site for parents and something will come up about racism, and people who live with their brown-skinned child in a all white neighborhood say, oh, well, that's never happened. I know that my kids as teens are very aware of seeing themselves reflected. And we've made very conscious decisions to make sure they had people that reflected them. We have a Latino pediatrician and dentist, and my daughter is now in a school, it's a Catholic school that's 40% Latina. And that was really important because race and how they're perceived in the world, as somebody said, your white privilege does not extend to your kids. When they are out in the world, they need to be armed and aware and proud of who they are as it pertains to race and culture. And so I think if we're not thinking about that and talking about that regularly, I feel like it's a fail. We need to do that, particularly now, because there is so much more awareness. And, you know, my kids, my daughter in particular, she likes the line from the Purge trailer, like, white people, they're the worst. So our kids are aware of it, so we need to be talking about it.
Well, thank you so much for all your answers. So I was going to move over to some of our next questions, and these questions might not apply to everyone. These are questions submitted by anonymously by adoptees who are part of families who are constructed of both biological children and adopted children. So the first question the question that came up a few times is, do you love me as equally as your biological children? Do you notice a difference? And so that was the first one. And then the second one that kind of piggybacked on that was, do you notice a difference between parenting your biological children versus your adopted children? Was another question that was kind of piggybacked on that original question. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Yeah, so I saw those questions in advance. Kat shared them with us, and I've really been thinking a lot about this question, mostly in terms of how I can communicate this. That the short answer on the love question is emphatically and 100% yes. And I guess the best way that I can communicate it is maybe just a short story about when I first met my son. I've come to the conclusion that parental love is binary. It's either your kid or not your kid. There's no, in between that the adopted kid is here and the other kids are here. It's either yes or no. And when I first, it wasn't when I took custody of my son, I visited him for like 3 days when he was 6 weeks old. And when I first had him, I'd say for the first 24 hours or so, it felt a lot like I was looking after my friend's child or my niece or nephew. You know, lovely baby. I like the baby, but not my baby. And something biological happened to me over the period of 3 days where literally he started to look different to me. He started to sound different. I started to feel different when he cried. And it went from not my child to my child. And there was nothing in between. I mean, the adoption, and to maybe go to the second part of the question, the fact that he's adopted is very, very important as far as who he is, and sort of a filter that we need to look at. You know, my husband and I really try not to get, I guess, lazy. You know, he's our 4th kid. And so we try not to say, okay, well, we've seen that in number 1s and 3s, so we know how to handle that, because there is a different lens that we have to look through. But when it comes to like how my husband and I feel and how his older siblings feel, the adoption has virtually no context for us. And in fact, his siblings have said this, and his father have said this too, when people make comments that we talked about earlier in the panel, referring to the adoption, it takes me a minute to kind of get back to that context of, oh, they're talking about the fact that he's adopted. Because, and like I said, I just, all I can say to answer this question is I can promise you, whether you're an only child, whether you have siblings who share your parents' DNA, other adopted siblings, your parents' hearts have gotten to the exact same place as they would have if they had given birth to you. I can promise you that. That's it.
Well, thank you so much for your answer. And also thank you for taking the time to think about that too. I really enjoyed your answer to that question. And then moving on to some more kind of like questions that came from a deeper place from the adoptees within the community. The next question was for the adoptees who haven't gone back to Guatemala, but have gone on other trips. It was a common question that, why have you not taken me back to Guatemala as much as we've gone on other family trips? And I'm gonna pass the mic over to Paige.
With my son, we didn't go back because we didn't travel that much with him. I had been in Guatemala and it was very busy, and he had a lot of fear of crowds. And I look back and think maybe that was lazy parenting. But then we adopted our daughter, and my daughter had a lot of fear. She did not even want to do a Zoom call as recently as 2 years ago with her foster family, because in her mind, any connection to Guatemala meant she would have to go back, and that somehow she would not be, it would break our family apart. So that was, for us, it was our kids' sensitivity to it. And when I was living in Antigua with my daughter, it was primarily a wonderful experience, but I also had a couple of times I got spit on once and yelled at another time. And when they were really young, I didn't want anybody here or there questioning our family unit. And then as they got older and they started declaring it wasn't something they wanted to do, I didn't want to force them, because this is their story, this is their journey. And now that my son is an older teen, now he's interested in it. So as soon as pandemic is lifted, we will go. But I felt like this needed to be their choice. And I struggle with that sometimes, because when they're little, you're kind of in charge and you can do it. But I did not want to take the chance of traumatizing them in any way when they were, that was one of the few areas that they were sensitive about. So that's why we went to Mexico, to Mayan areas, where at least they would see the indigenous culture and everybody looked like them, and I towered over everybody and they were right in there.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's something that's really common. And in myself too, when I was really little, I didn't understand what it meant really to go back. I knew through just words that in a literal sense that this is where I was born and this is where I came from. But it took a really long time for me to really connect the dots of this is where I'm from. And this is the culture that I was born into. So the first time that my family went, it was a pretty big group. In my eyes, it was even more of a vacation than it was of me going back to the country where I was from, because I just couldn't connect the dots. And I think that's a very common thing where as you get older, the idea of going back becomes a lot different than when you're younger. And so when we went back the second time, I was quite a bit older, and it was a lot more of an intentional trip for me because, I was older and I could connect the dots more. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica.
I'm going to I'm going to concur with what you just said, Kat, and what Paige just said, which is that it's so complicated as a parent. Because often, even psychologists will, I know many, many adoptive parents, as I'm sure we all do. I'm in many groups, and I've heard from many, many parents that they were advised not to go back because their child has whatever challenge might be going on. They were afraid that it might worsen if they were brought back to Guatemala, or that they were afraid they would be left in Guatemala and they're struggling with attachment as it is. And, there was a whole myriad of issues that were contributing to parents making the decision that they made at that time. And I think probably for most parents at the time that they made the best decision they could. I will say, and that's what we can do because that's the information we have at that time. So what we did, because we adopted 2 kids, so when we adopted Mateo, of course, we brought Olivia back. So she's already going back when she's 3 years old to pick up Mateo. And then we made the decision we were just going to go back, all the time because it was something I enjoyed doing, to be honest. I love Guatemala and I would rather go there than anywhere in the world. So it was great for me. But I think every family makes a decision which is right for them at the time. And I will say it's never too late. It's never too late to go back. As an adult, maybe you'll get even more out of it than you will. I mean, for my kids, they went back so often that it's almost like a second home for them. But I think there's something really, really wonderful and profound about going as an adult and really understanding what it means and seeing it sort of for the first time as an adult. I think it would be really special to do that. So it's not too late. And as Kat was saying, going with a group, that's something I really recommend for people going back for the first time. I think it's really, really powerful to share that experience with other people who are adopted. And there's many groups that host trips like that. And that might be something young adults want to look into. And I'm going to have to turn my camera off for 1 second because my battery is about to go dead. I have to get my charger.
No worries. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
Okay, just to add on to all the other excellent comments. Now, it doesn't, as I said, with one exception, Guatemala is the only place we've traveled. So the why do you travel to other places doesn't really apply to us. But I did want to, one of the things I've done as part of my participation in this community is to spend a lot of time over many years running one of the big email lists and listening to people talk about these questions. And in addition to all of the personal questions, like what's the right thing for our family, for my child, when the child is maybe too young to make that decision for themselves, there's also been, I think, not anymore, but I go back 10 or 15 years and I saw this all the time, that this was not something that agencies were encouraging people to do. Or that there were certainly, let me put it a different way, there were certainly adoption agencies and people involved in adoption who were saying, it's scary, it's dangerous. And, then you go read the US State Department website about travel to Guatemala, which is all about the dangers. And so there's a lot of sort of what I think of now, knowing the country, as misinformation about how dangerous it is to travel. And I think people who didn't have the familiarity with the country and the region, it's easy to get keyed up on that, because as a parent, the last thing you want to do is put your child in danger. So it's easy to get confused by that, because the messaging out there is not always so positive. And again, this goes back to a whole set of issues. This is the US looking at Central America and saying, oh, it's dangerous down there. And that message is out there too, and I think affected people, and you have to kind of overcome it. I know one thing that really helped me was before we went, I was scared for that same reason. And I was wrong. It was totally fine. But I talked to a friend who did a lot of travel in Central America. And I said, so what's the danger level like? He basically said, it's not different from visiting an area you don't know in New York City. And once he said that, I was like, okay, fine. I know how to manage that. And this is fine. And now I feel totally at home there and have for a long time. But I think there's a certain amount of both cultural misinformation, and to some extent it comes from in the adoption community, there was this sort of sense of, well, now they belong to the new country, and that back there is tricky and difficult. And I think that affected people also.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
Just a quick note on that danger. I think that was fed to us so much that then I worried about it with the kids, and they're both very sensitive to things like that. And so I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to go back myself a couple of times. And so I went a few years ago, and I remembered, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. And it reinforced all the things I loved about Guatemala. And I'm glad I went without the kids to some extent, because now I feel like when we go, I am much more familiar and can be very supportive of all of the wonderful things in Guatemala. But yeah, I have to own that I kind of bought into the danger thing for a while, because that's what I heard. And I had a lot of trepidation because I was traveling by myself when I went there. But I am so glad I went and could say, yeah, like you said, Tom, it's like there are certain areas of New York where I'm not going to walk around outside at night. Great. So there are going to be certain places where there are going to be some limitations, but it's no different than the US with fewer guns.
I'm going to pass the mic over. Becky, did you want to say something? Okay, so then this is going to be the last question before we're going to open it up to the viewers who are watching live. So the last question, another hot topic, was birth families. Many of us have met our birth families. Many of us, including myself, have not met our birth families. So a lot of the adoptees' worries regarding birth families is the concern of the adoptive parents' reaction to that. So do you worry about your child/children meeting their biological families? If so, what are your concerns? Oh, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica. Or sorry, I read the wrong name. Laura.
Yes, so we do know our birth family. My husband and I had decided to kind of leave it up to our son to decide when that might happen. And each time we went back to Guatemala, well, I should say, when we first brought him home, we kind of, we hired one of those searchers just to find out kind of what the situation was and like where she was living and things like that, just before, for lack of a better phrase, the trail went cold for, down the road when he did want to find out more about her. And each time we went back, we kind of offered it to him, do you want to do this? And there was one year when he was 6 or 7 where he had said yes. And then he actually went to his oldest sister and kind of confided that, I just thought this was a really sweet way to put it, he wasn't quite ready for his family to get that big. And so, but then when he was 8, he said, I'm ready. And I think the only concern for my husband and I was his feelings. For us, we were confident in his love and attachment for us and us for him. But what we're afraid of is, and we try to tell him as best as you can tell an 8-year-old that we don't know what we're going to find. We don't know if we can find her. We don't know if she's going to be open to meeting us, things like that. And I think that was the main concern, was him, exposing those really intense feelings. And it ended up working out just wonderfully. She's just an amazing person and has been a positive part of his life. But it is sort of that moment, almost like you sense a tipping point where this could go really badly or this could go really well. And that's frightening as a parent not to know. And I'll also just give a shout out. I'm not going to say his name, but a member of your community actually traveled back with us. And he was kind of with us every step of the way. And he was kind of Franklin's big brother through the whole thing. So he knows who he is. And we value him as part of Frank's story.
Well, it's funny you say that because I know who that is. And that is actually one of my good friends who mentioned that they know you when they saw the panel banner. So that's actually I was going to tell you that after the panel, but I'm glad you brought it up. And it's interesting what else you said is I'm someone kind of like your son. I go back and forth, and I still have not chosen to meet my birth family. But I go back and forth almost, I would say like weekly, almost daily, because it is such a big thing. And I myself have some of the concerns that you were talking about. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to my mom, Becky.
All right. We're part of and have been parts of big adoptive community groups. And I think there are fears, real and unreal, that adoptive parents have about their children meeting their biological families. It is that, will they be found? Will they be welcomed? What is the circumstance? Some of the early folks who went back to Guatemala had some really different and kind of challenging experiences that we heard about. So I think, there were some questions and concerns when my kids were really young. I think then you go through kind of a different stage, at least some of us did, when our kids are in those kind of middle school angsty years. I know parents who worried like, well, my kid, I'm the one who's disciplining, things like that. And I'm worried that they're going to want to go back to this idealized birth family. And so I think that, some adoptive families have those kinds of issues and concerns. And I think over time, at least in our family, we've kind of always talked about, been open to talking about anything. And to this point, neither of my daughters have wanted to pursue that. There have been times when Kat and I talked about it pretty seriously and she was really interested, and then she wasn't and put it away. And so I think, there are emotional fears and concerns that parents have, and how those play out change over time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So this idea that, you could be replaced is not something that I've worried about personally with my kids. But what I have seen, because, my sister found her biological mother and my niece has chosen not to, and my cousin did. And I see the stories that go beautifully and go horribly sideways. And things did not go well for my sister because it wasn't what she expected. So with my kids, what I worry about is their feelings. And my son, and I let him tell me when. We are now working with the searcher. We have just discovered his mom is alive, but we have kind of a cold trail. And once we found that she was okay, he panicked and said, do I have to meet her? Do I have to have this interaction? And so I realized I just don't want him to get hurt in any way, because we don't know her circumstance. and she may not want to acknowledge him, or she might. I also really worry about disrupting her life and want to let her take the lead as much as my son. His birth father is not involved, but she would be, and make sure that it works for her. Because again, I don't know if she's married, does she have kids, does her current partner know anything about it? So those are my two biggest worries, is my son somehow being disappointed and hurt, or providing an irreparable disruption in his birth mother's life. For my daughter, she has a lot of negativity around her birth mother. And on that one, we're just going to let that ride until she decides that she wants to pursue it. And I want to make sure that at that time, she's in a place where not only will this be beneficial to her or a good experience for her, but that her anger is not going to be driven towards her birth mother. I don't want that experience for her birth mother, who, as many of us have discussed, has made an incredible sacrifice. Her situation was a little different. She was a very young minor, but I know that because of that, she's had horrible trauma. So I don't want to add to that for anybody. That's it.
Thank you so much. And now I wanted to open up the conversation to the live stream questions. Let's see what we have. Let's see. We have a comment. So I want to share a comment first. So I think this is something that Paige said earlier, that because of the complexion and just how Guatemalan adoptees look, there is an expectation of language. And someone commented that they appreciate that, kind of acknowledging that expectation of language that's put upon adoptees. So that was just a little shout out there. And then here's a question. Did the parents know how to proactively help the young adoptees with all the trauma they were experiencing leaving their birth countries? Did you feel prepared? So I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question because I saw it in the chat. I think it's a really important question. And my answer would basically be no. That is, when you go into adoption as an adoptive parent, the preparation is about what you learn for yourself, but the kind of guidance through this comes from the adoption agency. And I think that particular thing is something that not all adoption agencies are bad at, but most of them are. At least most of the ones that I've run into. They tend to focus on the positive side, which you can kind of understand. And, adoption, it's going to, here's how to make it go well, and so on. And the trauma of it, we really had to learn about ourselves. And we were better prepared with our second child. Because we had learned about it some. But I feel like this is something that's really not handled well in general in the adoption system, in terms of the agencies, at least the ones that I've run across, don't do a good job of this, and parents kind of have to figure it out on their own. And I think there are some that do, and there's a lot of material out there that you can read and learn about, but the system doesn't encourage you to pay attention to that. So you have to kind of figure it out on your own.
Thank you so much. And to comment on that, the more I talk to parents, other adoptees, people just involved in the adoption community, it seems like there's been this narrative of, oh, you've adopted a child, story's over. You just raised them, they're your family now. And what I think we all kind of come to find out pretty quickly is that it's never over. The adoption story, the adoption process, it is never over. You're always learning new things. So I think it's really great that this question was asked. I'm going to pass the mic over to my mom, Becky.
I think that a lot of the preparation for adoption focused what there was, and there wasn't a whole lot, but was about the trauma of adoption, concerns about attachment and health, but not so much about interracial adoption, dealing with interracial issues, prepping on what to anticipate, how to deal with family, friends, things like that. That wasn't really there. Groups like Families with Children from China, La Semana, provided speakers and things on some of those subjects, but I don't think that there's nearly enough really good preparation for international adoptions in the adoption community.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
So my adoption agency had zero having to do with adoption trauma. They did talk about transnational, transcultural, and that aspect of it, but not adoption overall, with the separation from both, for my son, birth mother, and my daughter having a second loss at 14 months from her foster family, and how that deeply bonded relationship would disrupt her life. I thought I was prepared because my sister was adopted at 3.5 and had a lot of trauma that has affected her whole life. So I thought, oh, okay, I understand how this might work. But honestly, no, because every kid is different and how it shows up is different. I thought my son had zero issues. And then I realized he was depressed and had other things going on that I finally realized, oh my gosh, of course that's related to this. So I would say I became much more aware in the last 5 years. And we see a family therapist who specializes in adoption and international adoption and lots of things that has been helpful. I've done a lot of reading, but I would absolutely say I was not fully prepared. And I wish agencies would do a much better job with preparing parents, because to your point, it's not over when they're adopted. And I knew this would continue, but I didn't know what to expect or what was possible. And I wish I had, though I don't know if I would have changed anything earlier in their lives or not, but I would have been perhaps better prepared now and seen things and realized, oh, well, that's related to this, as opposed to dismissing that and thinking it was just personality or something else.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica.
I'm concurring with everything, but I just wanted to add one thing, which is I always say it's so interesting because we live in the Bay Area. Paige, I know you live in the Bay Area too, I've discovered, which I call the epicenter of therapy, because literally on every corner there's a therapist in San Francisco. I mean, everywhere you go. And yet there are so few who specialize in adoption and who specialize in international adoption. And I say this from experience. I would again often say I know more than therapists. I mean, not that I, am tooting my own horn here, but through my experience, I felt like I had become educated about the issues around international adoption. So, and more than a therapist who was trained. So I just want to say this one thing, which is that my hope is that your generation, Kat, and your cohort of young people who have been adopted and who have the experience of being adopted internationally, I hope some of you become psychologists, MSWs, therapists, and can lead the way in educating all of us through your experience. So I just wanted to add that. So that's my hope, that going forward, we will all do better.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I actually think about that a lot myself. I think about, well, how cool would young Kat have thought there'd be this older, also Guatemalan adoptee who'd gone through that? Because, I grew up around a lot of adoptees in my community. I think I tried to count how many were on my block growing up. I think in the past 2 or 3 decades, at least over 10 on my block alone. And I think about how cool it was that I had those older influences who'd been through either, whether it be domestic or, international adoption, how helpful that was and how important it was to me, and how there are people who didn't have that experience and how important it is for all adoptees to kind of have someone who'd gone through the experience themselves. And so I think about that a lot, and I'm glad you brought that up. And so then the next question, and I think that this is going to be our last question of the panel. This is another question from the live stream comments, is if you could give any advice to a parent whose child is interested in finding their birth family, what would it be? And I'm going to pass the mic over to Laura.
Yeah, so this is just my experience. Our son was quite young when he wanted to meet his birth family, so it was required for either my husband or myself to be intimately involved, right? But I can say for a fact, the experience of helping him and being involved in finding his mom has made us so much closer and given us this shared experience that how many people on the planet really have, right? And so I would say, to the extent your kid is okay with it, be as involved as you can. And sometimes that's putting your emotions, it's giving you exposure, but you're still the mom or the dad, and you still know him or her better than most and can still be there to support them. And if it's like my experience, it'll make you closer in the long run, not further apart.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Tom.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And two things. One is a practical comment in answer to that question, which is use a professional to do the finding. It's very important. It's important for the safety of the birth family and for a whole lot of other reasons. And there are people who are very, very good at this and have been doing it for a long time. And we know who they are and can pass that info on if it's needed. But the other one that's the thing that came to my mind first is just follow your child's lead. They're in charge. That what they want to do, the back and forth that you described, Kat, I think is totally normal. And if the child says, I want to, I don't want to, great, follow all of it.
Thank you so much. We do have one more question, and I think we have time for just one last question. The last question is, when did you have the first contact with another adoptive parent who had adopted from Guatemala? What did that mean to you? I'm going to pass the mic over to Paige.
I had contact with other adoptive parents from Guatemala as soon as I decided to adopt from Guatemala. I started talking to others that were in the same process that I was. They were waiting for referral, people that were post-referral, people who had had kids come home. And I think that Jessica had mentioned, we have a lot of adoptive families in the Bay Area and a lot of Guatemalan adoptive families. And it was nice to have someone who had some shared values in terms of both adoption and then international adoption, and to be able to ask the questions of, even if someone was only 2 months or 6 months ahead of me on the journey. And it was nice to have a collective when my kids were really little, so they saw other families before they started school, where we had other families that looked like ours, where it was just normalized. Like, this is just, there are other families just like ours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Jessica.
I want to say that having contact with other adoptive families is one of the most important things we have done, I would say. We are part of a large community in the Bay Area. We're very well connected. Our family hosts a party every year that many, many families come. And we've gone to Heritage Camp, where we are really connected to adoptive families. And my daughter has recently said to me, these are my people. It's like really interesting. And I just want to plagiarize a sentence that I heard someone who was adopted from South Korea say, which was in an interview that I heard. And he said, our homeland is each other. And that was the most profound sentence I had heard in years. And I just think about that a lot in terms of my kids with our community of adoptive families. And so we are such a unique group, all of us, with our adoptive families. We're not like other families. And our children's homeland is each other. The people who understand them best are other people who are living that experience. So the question was, when did we start? We started pretty young, right from the beginning when our kids came home. We were lucky because we live near other families who are interested in communicating together. And so very good question, and really, really important to find that community for your kids.
Thank you so much. And that's something that resonates with me too. When I found the Next Generation Guatemala community, I found so many people who kind of felt similar to I did, where I don't fit completely into white culture, white American culture, and I don't fit completely into Guatemalan culture. I'm right there in the middle. And finding the Guatemalan community to me was like finding, or Guatemalan adoptee community was like finding a new type of home where I was comfortable, where I could talk to people who felt very similar to me, or who had gone through similar things. So I think there's so much truth to that Korean adoptee that you were quoting. And then it is about 2:30, which means that we are going to be ending our parent panel. I want to thank all you parents for participating and making this possible. I also want to thank the viewers for watching and sending in questions. I know that there were more questions than we had time for. And I'm not going to say that this is by any means the last parent panel we're ever going to do. This is definitely, hopefully, an ongoing kind of thing that we get parents involved, adoptive parents involved in the conversation, because I think a lot of adoptees do have questions for adoptive parents, as we are seeing right now through our live stream. If you have any questions for me personally, my email is nggsecretary@gmail.com. And if you have any questions for the parents, you're also welcome to email me. We talked about kind of getting contact information out there to the adoptee community. So that might be a possibility. And again, lastly, I'd like to thank you all just one more time for participating today. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, guys. And the panel is officially ended.